All right, so welcome to today's monthly Feed Your Mind series as part of No Shame on You's virtual Lunch and Learns. And we do it monthly on a variety of different topics. I mentioned before last month was seasonal affective disorder. And next month, we're going to be talking about women and music therapy. So stay tuned for that. Today, we are doing Introducing Space. Supportive Parenting for Anxious Childhood Emotions. And I'm Wendy Singer, and I work for an incredible Chicago-based nonprofit called No Shame on You. And on behalf of our board of directors, our staff, and our volunteers, we welcome you to today's program. No Shame on You is an incredible organization dedicated to eliminating stigma associated with mental health challenges so people who need the help will seek it, family and friends will know how to support their loved ones, and to ultimately save lives, which is just an incredible mission. We achieve it through online public programming like we're doing today. We have an online presence of over 120,000 on social media, Facebook being our largest. So if you don't follow us on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, please do it today because you'll see our free resources and all sorts of great things. We have blogs, podcasts, crisis information, all sorts of things. And we also do presentations all over the community for schools, nonprofits, businesses, all on mental health topics. So today I want to introduce a really, really, really special person. Her name is Mariah Bracken. She's a licensed clinical social worker who's passionate about helping children realize their full potential. And she's going to talk about a little bit about herself. She has a practice in Northbrook, Illinois, called Bracken Therapies, easy to remember. But just a little bit of a personal connection. She was also a middle school social worker and where my kids attended. And she is the Pied Piper of kids. She's amazing. She's an amazing clinician. She's amazing support to parents. And when I heard she was offering this space program, I wish that we had it when my kids were a little younger. And I'm so excited for you to be here, Mariah. Thank you for doing this and take it away.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Wendy. And I also want to apologize for the state of my voice. We're going to work through it if you can just excuse the raspiness. But thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here and to talk about space. I'm very passionate about this therapy approach, and I'm excited to talk to you all about it.
Before you begin, Mariah, just a little housekeeping. If anyone
Yes.
has questions, I forgot to mention this. If anyone has questions during it, we're a small group. If you're comfortable, you can unmute or send your question to me in the chat. I'll be monitoring it, and we can take questions as we go, or you can wait till the end. Apologies.
No, yes, please feel free to ask questions during the presentation. So like Wendy shared, my name is Mariah Bracken. I've been a school social worker for about 10 years, worked in many different settings from elementary schools, a life skills program, and middle school. I worked at a private practice on the side and just fell in love with that work. So I opened up my own practice this summer. As I went into going into my private practice, I was really looking for something to ground my work with parents because working with kids, I know how important it is. The parents' involvement is so important to the child's success and progress in therapy. And that's when I found space and absolutely loved it. So I am a trained space therapist as well and have parent clients. So I just wanted to go over what exactly I would be covering today. I will go over what space is, and we'll talk about what space is, who space is for. I want to take a little time to review anxiety and define what anxiety and anxiety disorders are. We'll go over family accommodations because space is all about breaking the accommodation cycle that families do when they have a child with anxiety or OCD. We'll discuss how to increase support. I'll walk through what a cycle of space treatment looks like. I want to give you some takeaways if you're a parent or if you're a professional that work with kids with anxiety. I want to make sure that you leave feeling like you have some tangible things you can start to incorporate right now. And then also, if you are a parent, um, and you, after this conversation, you're interested, you feel like space might be a good fit for you and your family, I will tell you how you can get in touch with the space provider. Just as a note, this presentation, although we talk about what occurs during space, does not replace space treatment with a trained provider. So, what is SPACE? Like Wendy said, SPACE stands for Supportive Parenting for Anxious Childhood Emotions. It is a relatively new treatment developed by Dr. Eli Lebowitz from the Yale Study Center. A lot of his, there we go. A lot of his science and studies were just published in 2019. He also wrote a book about space that was only published in 2021. So this is really a pretty novel treatment and a new approach, but it's continuing to build traction and grow in popularity because it is so effective. Um, Oftentimes, when we talk about treating anxiety disorders in children, I think a lot of people are familiar with CBT or cognitive behavioral therapy, which is your typical approach of a therapist meeting with the child. And then maybe parents come in at the end of the session, or parents have their own session with the therapist to review what was taught or what happened in the session. And space is different because right now it is the only evidence-based treatment that works exclusively with parents and guardians. It focuses on increasing supports, which we'll talk about a little bit later, and decrease accommodations. It is meant to be a relatively short cycle. An entire space treatment is about 12 sessions. And with that, the hope is after parents and caregivers learn about how to notice accommodations, how to decrease accommodations, that they're able to do it more independently. So that's why it's only about 12 sessions. Space is for kids who are school age through teenagers. There actually is another course, so providers can get an additional training it's called their failure to launch. So there is even an approach for parents to best support their adult children with anxiety. What also makes space unique is that the child does not have to be in their own therapy for space to be effective. While of course that can absolutely be the case, and I know as a space provider myself, I've collaborated with children's therapists as I'm working with their parents, but it's not necessary. So this is also a great approach. I know some of my clients have been children who are teenagers who maybe aren't interested in therapy and they've tried the more traditional therapy route. The child's just not engaged, not motivated. I've had some clients where the child is going through their own journey with accepting their diagnoses and aren't ready for therapy, but the parents are still feeling like there's a need and they want to support. So I'm still able to provide an intervention, but the child does not have to be in therapy. The other thing is it is so focused on the parents. We're not asking the child to make any direct changes. We're not managing the child's behavior. It's really parent and caregiver centered, where they're making the changes to their routines, their environment, which the evidence had shown in turn impacts and benefits the child. So space works on anxiety problems like separation anxiety, social anxiety, generalized anxiety, obsessive compulsive disorder. And Space has a wonderful website. If you're interested in digging a little bit deeper on your own, you can always visit spacetreatment.net. So I want to talk a little bit about anxiety and make sure, as I'm talking about anxiety and mentioning it, that we're all on the same foundational understanding of what anxiety is. Anxiety is a normal response to things. It's a normalized feeling. Oftentimes, when I work with my child clients, I talk about imagine back when humans were first developed and they're cavemen trying to light those fires and like a predator comes. What are humans supposed to do? We're saying we're not, our brain grew not to think about, oh, there's a tree. I can't run towards the tree. I should run towards the water. No, you just have to get away from that bear. So our anxiety spikes. Our brain works, our amygdala, the part of the brain that manages our anxiety response, is highlighted. It shuts down the thinking part of our brain just so we can get to safety. It's a safety response. That's what elicits fight, flight, or freeze response. And as we're talking about anxiety disorders, according to the DSM-5, anxiety disorders differs from just developmentally normative fear of anxiety by being excessive or persisting beyond developmentally appropriate periods. So it's when that anxiety goes out of that normal range and it's either triggers more frequently that anxiety response or for seemingly low stress, low safety scenarios, that anxiety response is still occurring. And there is a difference when we're thinking about how adults manage anxiety and how a child manages anxiety. Oftentimes, Dr. Lebowitz talks about a baby cries when they're feeling a big feeling and they're waiting for their caregivers to take care of them. So our children's responses to their anxiety are naturally intertwined with their parents and that reliance on their caregiver, which brings us into space and why it's so effective as an approach to manage and overcome those child anxiety symptoms. So oftentimes, as we're talking about those caregivers and caregivers' responses, there tends to be what's called an accommodation loop. So if we use the example of a child being anxious to fall asleep on their own, so they're laying in bed, they're feeling distressed, they're feeling anxious. So they might call for their parents to come in the bedroom and say, Mom, Dad, I need you to lay with me until I fall asleep. So of course, the caregiver or family to help soothe, help their child cope with that distress might accommodate. So when I mean accommodate, they'll maybe forgo their plans for the evening, their TV time, or spending more time with their spouse and lay in bed with their child. And what does that do? It'll reduce that distress response. It'll soothe the child. They'll get that coping that they were looking for. So those intense feelings of anxiety will be temporarily reduced. In doing so, now it's sending the message to the child, you're right, you can only fall asleep when I'm laying in bed with you. And the child's learning my coping tool for managing that distress is when my mom or dad is laying with me. So they'll continue to be dependent on that parental or guardian laying in bed with them in order for them to fall asleep, which then maintains that high level of stress or anxiety during nighttime. And then that continues. So what space does is it comes in and we're trying to break up that loop so the child can begin to increase their own independent coping tools so they can learn how to manage those distressing situations on their own.
Mariah, a quick question that came in.
Sure.
Is there a sweet spot of an age for the space program, a recommended like time where it's going to hold the most for
Sure.
the child, not for the
Yeah,
parent?
sure. So I think not necessarily. I think as soon as you're starting to notice some of those increased um, anxiety systems, or as soon as anxiety is starting to manifest itself, I would say as soon as this can get started to lay that foundation, the better. But I don't think there's any cutoff or I've been doing this too late, because I think as a child gets older, their anxiety shifts and the accommodations shift. So it can always be impactful. Like I said, it's recommended around 5, I would say up until high school. But even, there is that additional training for failure to launch for adult parents to work with their adult children. So I would say no
Thank you.
necessary sweet spot. Yeah, great question.
Awesome.
So I'll be talking a lot about accommodations. So I'd like to quickly touch on what an accommodation is. An accommodation is an adaptation to the environment or routine with the desired outcome of decreasing those feelings of discomfort. So through a space lens, most accommodations fall within 2 categories: participation or
Hi,
modification.
Pumpkin. Wanna go outside?
So a participation accommodation is when the parent or caregiver almost gets sucked into their child's anxious brain. So what that might look like is, in my previous example, laying in bed with your child. In terms of children who've been diagnosed with OCD, maybe when they're washing their hands, your child doesn't like even getting the germs of touching the soap dispenser. So maybe for them to come home, it's a part of the routine for the parents to stand by the sink and pump soap out for them. So the parents participating, actually engaging in some of those anxiety or OCD routines. So that's participation. And then modification is when parents kind of independently are adapting or changing their own schedules, their own routines to hopefully avoid triggering any of those anxiety reactions. So that may be at your job, you refuse to take early morning meetings because you need to be present to help your child get to school on time, because that might be a struggle. A modification may be, um, your child has separation anxiety, so you just naturally say no to going out to dinner in the evenings because you know your child can't handle it. You're modifying your own schedule in order to adapt to the manifestation of your child's anxiety. So when we're talking about accommodations, we're including both participation and modification. And I want to talk a little bit about intent versus impact, because even Dr. Lebowitz says good parents accommodate. It's natural to accommodate. And the purpose of space isn't to say you can never, ever accommodate for your child ever again. That's not the case. And we also know that these accommodations are coming from the best of intentions. It's because it's so hard to see your child struggling. You don't want them to be experiencing this distress and discomfort. Of course, it's a natural response, but it's just thinking in the big picture, especially as we're talking about those specific accommodations related to an anxiety disorder. Is it helping? Is the impact of it, is it helping? Or is it just making it where your child isn't learning the skills to independently overcome distress themselves? Because as we know, distress and discomfort can never be fully accommodated for, because that's just life. So it's to best equip your child with the ability to manage it on their own and get through it to hopefully decrease those symptoms of anxiety. I just want to make sure we touch on that intent versus impact, because this isn't to say a parent's doing something wrong, just to provide tools on maybe how to be more supportive. So as I said, in space, it's about 12 sessions, which normally includes an introduction. The space provider then will teach you ways to increase how to better support your child. And then it's looking at what accommodations are occurring in your home and really mapping out what's happening each day and how are parents accommodating for their child's anxiety. And then really, we're just modifying one accommodation at a time. So it's then going through the process and how to pick a target to work on, developing a plan around it, informing the child, actually implementing that plan, troubleshooting along the way, maybe going through a second accommodation to make a plan and kind of roll that accommodation back, talking about how to best support the child as you're decreasing that accommodation and how to maybe troubleshoot and manage possible negative responses from the child. And then, like I had said, the hope is after parents have gone through these cycles, they're able to do it kind of on their own. So termination may occur after about 12 sessions. So one of the first parts of space is increasing and utilizing supportive statements or increasing support. Typically, when working with caregivers, when working with parents, as we talk about these supportive statements, what I've noticed is parents tend to fall in one of two camps: the protective parent and then the demanding parent, or somewhere in the middle. But it seems to be that one parent leans more protective, one leans more demanding. And what I mean by that is when a parent falls more into that protective category, their response when their child displays heightened anxiety is to help their child avoid that distressing situation altogether. So those parents may say things like, but they need me to do it for them. Or it's just too overwhelming to do that. It's so much easier if I just do it for them. It's so much faster. It's not a big deal. I'll just do it so that way we can get on with their day and they don't have to get upset. So that's that protective parent. I kind of visualize it as that's the parent standing in front of their kid with their arms out saying, I got you, don't worry about this. And then the opposite, the other side of that is maybe the more demanding parent. So I visualize that as the parent standing behind their kid, kind of pushing them. They're behind them saying, oh, it's fine. It's not a big deal. It's not scary. I know you say it's scary. It's actually not scary. You'll be fine. Or even you're just doing it for attention. Just get through it. So neither of these are really that helpful when we're dealing with a child with a true anxiety disorder. So what we talk about is the sweet spot, which is almost combining the two, but we phrase it as best way to support your child is to combine validation and confidence. So in terms of that protective parents, the protector acknowledging the feelings that it's hard, no matter what the situation is, even from an adult lens. If you're like, this shouldn't be that anxiety provoking, you're fine, you're safe. To your child, those feelings are really true and really real. So we want to make sure that we validate the true feelings that the child is experiencing, but also give them that confidence, that empowerment that they can get through it and they can overcome it. So a lot of the foundational intervention of space is saying these supportive statements. And what I love about them, I'm not saying by any means just saying a supportive statement is going to eliminate any manifestation of anxiety. but I think it sends the right message, that, and it starts to shift the child's mindset, even just a little bit, that they are capable of doing this hard thing. So a supportive statement may sound like, I know this feels overwhelming, but I'm sure you can do it. I can see this is really scary for you, but you got this. Or I know this is hard right now and you can manage it. So it's combining the validation, acknowledging those feelings are real, but also empowering them that they can get through it. Because another one of those unintentional impacts of constantly accommodating for the anxiety, the unintentional message that's sending is, you're right, you can't do this. You need mom and dad to do it for you. You're right, this is too hard for you to do it. You need me to do it for you. And with these supportive statements, it's changing and shifting that messaging that they can do it themselves, even though it's feeling hard. So the next part of space is starting to chart accommodations. Typically what happens is I work with my clients to go through their day, morning, mid-morning, afternoon, after school, nights. And we're thinking about both those participation accommodations and the modification accommodations that are going on. What I found is, as parents are starting to look at their actions and their behaviors through that accommodation lens, most parents find that, at least parents I've worked with, there's a roughly like 15 to 20 accommodations that are happening during their day that I don't even think they realized were accommodations. So it's just kind of a brain dump to see where in your day are you actually accommodating for your child's anxiety. And then it's thinking, which accommodation do we want to start and kind of roll back? So like I said, I believe space is very trauma informed. Although we're focusing on the parents and what they're doing, we're not asking anything of the child. It's of course being mindful of the child's experience. So of those 15 to 20 accommodations, we really only work on one. So we do this in a very slow, digestible way. It's very systemic. It's a strategic approach, which makes it, supportive still for the child going through it. So we want to make sure it's a meaningful problem. It happens frequently enough where there's real practice and the child's really exposed to that decrease in the accommodation. We also want to make sure the accommodation is truly anxiety related. For example, you may accommodate your child during homework time and sit with your child to help them with math homework. Well, you're doing that because maybe your child really struggled with math. So like that's not an anxiety related accommodation. So that wouldn't be something that we would work on. And of course, we want the parents to be motivated to make this change. We're thinking because the parents are the ones making the change and doing the work, we want to make sure it's something that's valuable to them. Like maybe it is around bedtime because caregivers are losing their own bonding time. And they're like, we really want some of our night back. So it should be something that the caregivers are really motivated and have buy-in on. Then we'll work on
one more
actually.
question. I got
Oh,
one more
yes,
question that popped in.
absolutely.
The question is it advised that both parents attend the space training? And if it is a not traditional family and there's a divorce in the family still, that both, if they're living in two different households, do you recommend that both parents attend if that's an option?
I think if it's an option, absolutely, because I think to have that consistency between parents, whether they're in the same household or not, is really impactful and would be really beneficial. And I think a lot of that collaboration is really important. Of course, it's not always possible. So I think if that feels like a roadblock, it shouldn't stop you from seeking out space. If one parent even has more buy-in than the other. I think though Best practice would be for both parents to attend, but it's by no means exclusionary. And of course, I think any parent going through this would be helpful and impactful. But right, if both parents could attend, I think that would be wonderful and amazing.
That's awesome. Thank you.
Yeah. So then the next part of space is actually, like I said, making that plan. And when I work with my parents, I want this plan to be really detailed. And I even say, let's talk about everything. Let's talk about what we would do with all the what ifs. Let's talk about what you'll physically do yourself. Maybe the target is the child asks about their schedule 20 times a day. And we say, we're going to roll back that accommodation and only answer your child 2 times instead of 20 times. Well, chances are at the beginning, the child will still constantly ask, okay, so what are we doing after school? What are we doing after school? Let's talk about what will you do instead? Will you even need to put in headphones and listen to music to say, I've already told you those 2 times, I'm not going to answer again. We want parents to feel really comfortable and like this plan is really thought out so they know how to proceed in real life. So we make a very detailed plan of when are we going to do this, how many times, what to do instead, how to troubleshoot, and make a very detailed plan that parents are comfortable with. The next part is informing the child. We don't just do this with, decrease that accommodation without the child knowing. And that's, like I said, why I think this is so trauma informed, making the child comfortable. It is a unilateral decision because it's the parents making the change to their behavior. We're not asking the child to change any of their behaviors. I think unlike some other approaches and I think there still are plenty of situations where the child should be involved in this planning process. From a space lens, it really is all about the parents. Oftentimes, Dr. Lebowitz says, having a child dictate kind of how their day should go or how parents should treat them based on their anxiety is like having the person with the broken compass be leading the pack. We want to, as parents, what's best, and you're doing this change because you know it's best for your child, which is why it's coming from a place and in writing that letter saying, this is something I'm doing to best help you, but it's the change I'm making. So there's a very outline detailed of a equation that the letter should follow. And the parent should actually write this letter and read the letter to the child before the plan is implemented. So everything is kind of out there on the table. And then we get to the plan implementation where parents and caregivers follow through with that plan. Sometimes I give parents kind of data sheets if they want to jot down their child's responses or how it went. And then we'll review the child's reactions, their responses. Part of my role as a therapist, sometimes I think parents will come to me and say, this week went terribly because this happened and this happened and this happened. And it's part of my role. Yes, that happened, but did you notice he cried significantly less? Or you were still able to make it to work on time, even though it was hard, you made it on time when you haven't made it on time in months. So it's noticing those small wins because we know it can feel very overwhelming. And I think that's the benefit of going through space with the therapist is helping to look at those big pictures of successes. And then we start to talk about additional targets and cycles. Another important piece about space is building in outside supporters as well, getting the teacher involved. If grandparents babysit a lot, getting them involved to help with reinforcing all of these positive changes that are happening and to make sure that parents have a support system during this time. So that's about a cycle of space. Um, and as we're finishing up, I want to make sure that you feel like you can leave with really tangible takeaways from this space lens. I think, like I had said, using those supportive statements can be really helpful to kind of shift your child's mindset and even your mindset of how you respond when you have a child who's feeling really anxious. And maybe as I was explaining, maybe you were reflecting and thinking, oh, yeah, I definitely lean more as a protective parent, or I lean a bit more as a demanding parent. And you can start to think about where and when you can start incorporating those supportive statements. I think even just being aware of accommodations and reflecting, am I doing this to be helpful, or am I doing this because I'm truly accommodating for a manifestation of my child's anxiety? And just maybe be more thoughtful. Are there ways that you can start to support your child to kind of manage that anxiety themselves? I also think oftentimes parents want to be this pillar of strength for their kids and show that nothing bothers them. They're a stable force. And I think you can still do that with modeling how you yourself use coping skills. So I would always recommend you, if you've had a bad day or a frazzled day, or you're feeling anxious and it was a busy morning and you're finally getting into your car, talking through that out loud, like taking a deep breath with your child in the car with you, being, oof, I felt really anxious as we were getting out of the house this morning. I'm going to take some deep breaths so I can feel like I'm in a better headspace to go to work. Let's take some deep breaths together, really modeling how you yourself are managing some of that anxiety or stress. I think that's really helpful. Also, if you are interested in space, Dr. Lebowitz wrote a wonderful book called Breaking Free of Child Anxiety and OCD. It is essentially a space manual written for parents with kind of going through those action steps if you just want to learn a little bit more on your own. He also recommends, if you're really interested in space, working with a space provider. As providers, I really think of myself more as a guide to help answer questions and support parents, but really the parents are doing the work. So if anything that I shared about today is interesting, you can always look into getting his book or checking it out of the library. It's a really wonderful tool. So like I said, if you think space feels right for you, as Wendy said, I own a private practice in Northbrook. I am a trained space provider, and I'm currently accepting space parents. I can provide for anyone virtually in the state of Illinois. If you're interested, though, in finding a different provider or a provider closer to you, you can find providers on the space website. And people can choose after they've been through the training to post their information there. And you can find a provider that works for you.
And I want to mention too that our dear friends, there's a wonderful nonprofit organization in the Chicagoland area called JCFS Chicago, and they recently, they're a community-based mental health program, and they recently brought on the space
Amazing
model. So if you're looking for
Yes.
closer in the city, North Side and some other locations, check out JCFS Chicago. And for those of you who are zooming in across, there are people who come in from all over. Mariah, thank you for that search engine. I appreciate it so much. And if there are any questions, people can come off mute and just ask them. If not, while you're thinking of it or talking about it or chatting about it, I just wanted to first thank Mariah. You rock. And
Thank you.
I
Thank you
am
for having
grateful.
me.
I am so grateful for you professionally. You have been a rock for us. And in our
Singers are the best.
Uh, in the chat, I just put a really short survey. It takes literally 2 minutes or less to fill out. It helps us make sure that our programs are hitting the mark, number one, and number two, report back to our generous funders that we're so grateful for that make these programs free. So that is it. And we'll just hang on for a minute or two if anyone wants to hang in the virtual lobby with us for a moment. But that concludes our program today. Check us out. Our next one is in March on women and music therapy. So you'll get an email about that. Follow us on all of our channels, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you.